like we talked about, she did provide the lead to get him to the Texas School Book Depository. However, what's being withheld here is that there was another job offer to a higher paying job that was never conveyed to Lee. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, Connell. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. We are in a walkthrough of the JFK assassination. And today I'm really excited actually because we are going to be reading from Mrs. Payne's Garage by Thomas Mallon. And if you don't know, Mrs. Ruth Payne is one of those figures that you have to get to know in order to understand what happened in Dallas in November of 1963. Not only that, that's not just me saying that, but the Warren Commission, the men who were selected by President Johnson to investigate the JFK assassination, they asked Ruth Payne more questions than any other witness. And so they also thought that she was a key part of the story. So we need to zoom in onto Ruth Payne. Who was she? What role did she play? Why did she do what she did? And are there things that are suspicious that are not fully answered? These are the kinds of questions we want to ask when we look at the person and the role of Ruth Payne in the story of the JFK assassination. I do want to say from the start that I've had some people misunderstand this in the past. We went through the documentary called The Assassination in Mrs. Payne. And I would get people who would immediately comment and say, this is slander. You're accusing her of being part of the conspiracy to kill the president. And I want to say from the beginning that that is not my goal at all, that I don't believe that she knowingly was a part of the assassination of President Kennedy. However, that does not mean that she did not play a role. It does not mean that she didn't have a role perhaps in intelligence, perhaps as a babysitter or a CIA asset that had some sort of influence or managerial babysitter type role in the life of Lee and Marina Oswald. That's the real question that I look at when I'm looking at the person of Ruth Payne. Other people may have their own thoughts. Maybe people do believe she was a part of it. I personally don't believe that, but I do think it is highly likely, based on what I know from my research and reading, that she probably was an asset of intelligence in some way. Was she an employee? Possibly. I mean, when Jim Garrison did his investigation and tried to obtain the tax returns for Ruth and Michael Payne, he was told that they were classified and unavailable to him. So to me, that signals that perhaps she actually was somehow receiving some monetary reimbursement from a government organization. I don't have proof of that. No one does, because those records were classified by the federal government. So we're all left without those answers. My personal suspicion is that part of the reason why the delays of documents being released has been because she continues to live. She's still alive in California now. And if you happen to be watching this, Ruth, we would love for you to tell us what you know, for you to square with the American people, for you to do what is right, and let us know what you know before the chance is gone. That's my appeal to Ruth Payne. Well, today we are going to be reading from a book that Ruth actually enjoyed. In the documentary that I just mentioned, The Assassination in Mrs. Payne, it's a wonderful documentary by a documentarian named Max Good. If you want to watch it, I'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. But in that documentary, she noted that this was the book that when it was written, she felt like, oh, good. I don't have to write a book after all. He explained everything the way that I would have done. So let's get into this book. Let's read the selection that talks about how she came into the life of Lee and Marina Oswald. We're going to lean in, we're going to listen, and we're going to evaluate if it makes sense, just as normal human behavior, and also what what explanations might also be alternative explanations for the behavior that we're going to observe. So we're going to get going, and we start out with some information about Ruth. Ruth had been studying Russian since 1957 at Berlitz, on phonograph records, in summer classes at Penn and Middlebury. Her interest in the language itself was only increased by participation in the Young Friends organization, specifically its East-West Contacts Committee, which sponsored the American travels of 3 young Soviets, a journalist, a factory worker, and an economics student in 1958. Ruth helped with preparations for their tour and met the Russians at a party in Philadelphia, but she was not one of the 5 Americans who accompanied them throughout the United States. She had a more direct involvement with the Young Friends Pen Pal program, a goodwill exchange set up by the Committee of Soviet Youth Organizations. Nina Aparina of Krasnodar became Ruth's correspondent and eventually the astounded recipient of a Christmas photo taken in an obviously balmy Texas. One of the things that is funny about Texas is we don't always have super wintry winters. I remember one Thanksgiving where in the photo we're all wearing shorts. It is fairly common to have a week in the 60s or 70s in November, in December, in January. Now, it'll still get colder, but we often have balmy weather during the holidays. Ruth's intensive Russian study at Middlebury in the summer of 1959 came just before the move to Irving and Lynn's birth. It was an overreach. She had pried a last-minute opening out of a director who was right to turn me down the first time, since her language skills simply weren't strong enough for the program's immersion technique. She promised to speak the entire summer nothing but Russian, and the experience proved kind of lonely. A rarefied preview of what awaited her in Texas, but it also represented a last chance to do something away from home. A motivation her husband credited more easily than others did. As she wrote her mother, who was skeptical of her plans, "I feel Michael's support for my going, and feel that going will not injure what we have in our marriage that we want to keep. Support from the culture, so to speak, is, as you would expect, negative, expressed by acquaintances, is Michael going too? Or how does Michael feel about that? Or I wouldn't feel right being away from my husband that long." 4 years later, in the winter of 1963, the Reverend Carol Hyde, newly accustomed to independence from her own husband, would be delighted that her daughter was now proficient enough in Russian to have lined up a summer job tutoring the language at Dallas's St. Mark's School. "Great," she wrote Ruth on February 12th. "Let's hope enough students sign up." So from this, we gather she's from the Northeast. She has undertaken a program of spending an intensive Russian study for the summer of 59 before she's moving to Irving. She was not concerned about the effects on her marriage, even though reportedly by herself, multiple people were like, "That doesn't seem normal inside of a marriage. Is he going with you? What's happening? Why would you leave him for a whole summer?" And her own mother apparently became a reverend. So those are some facts about her that we can glean from just the selection that we've read so far. That same February, Everett Glover, with whom she'd sung madrigals here, recalled her linguistic interest when he started planning a get-together at his home in Highland Park. Highland Park is just north of downtown Dallas. It's a very ritzy area. It's where we always go to look at Christmas lights every Christmas. It's so beautiful at Christmas time, and a very, very wealthy area. One of his guests would be a young American who had spent time in the USSR. The chance for Ruth to converse in Russian with the fellow Soviet's wife might be a treat for both women, he thought. Everett's? The notation, still visible in the square labeled Washington's birthday on Ruth's 1963 Hallmark pocket calendar, was not met by its question mark to indicate any lack of enthusiasm for attending Glover's party, not even after Michael came down with a bad cold and decided not to join Ruth there. It reflected only Glover's save-the-date tentativeness in the first of 2 phone calls he made with the invitation. Even so, it's hard not to see in the little interrogative a life poised over its own fate, still able to tip one way and avoid it, or plunge straight down to what it held. So the implication here is that there was no intent on Ruth to go and meet Marina Oswald. The implication by that last sentence is that had she chosen otherwise, had the question mark been answered with a no, then she would have been able to tip one way and avoid this whole fate of being a person at the center of the question marks of the JFK assassination. But instead, she would plunge straight down to the fate held for her in this one little written plan on a calendar square. February 22nd fell on a Friday, one day after President Kennedy sent Congress his proposal for Medicare, the sort of social betterment program that kept Ruth one of his enthusiastic supporters. Another item in the same day's news, the feckless attack by 2 Cuban aircraft against a drifting American shrimp boat, was the sort of story more likely to interest the guests holding forth in Everett Glover's kitchen when Ruth Payne first laid eyes upon him. With his soft voice and receding hairline, 23-year-old Lee Oswald appeared much less exotic than his experience, which he now eagerly recounted to a small group of partygoers. They asked him, Ruth remembers, why he went to the Soviet Union and what his impressions were. Everett had not told her that the young man had actually been a defector, but Oswald, currently employed in the photo department of a graphic arts company, now spoke critically of the USSR, where he had begged to stay in the fall of '59, just as Ruth was beginning to accommodate herself to Texas. Okay, I have to say, first of all, that as I read this book, it just stands out to me. It's sort of like reading the letters of Paul in the Bible. If you don't know, when you read Paul, he has phrase, comma, dependent clause, comma. You have to read through a series of things to get to the point of what the sentence is about. And I'm feeling that as I'm reading aloud. It's the same sort of kind of getting past the next thought and the next thought and the next thought to get to the point. So if you feel that as you're listening, I feel it as I'm reading. He really enjoyed being the center of attention, says Ruth, but that night she paid him less of it than did the other listeners. She was eager to meet Oswald's wife, busy at that point in the bedroom, taking care of the couple's baby girl. I wanted to see if I could talk with her, if we could communicate. In the event, they managed to, though Ruth felt too embarrassed by her own Russian to say much. She was taken by something in this girl, a full decade younger than herself and so obviously isolated. Here was the chance, in future, less hectic circumstances, to speak Russian with someone. And here, too, was an opportunity, yet perceived only dimly, for Ruth to alleviate her own loneliness. We've had it implied already that she did not relish the time of being home with her children. Earlier, we were told that this was the last chance for her to do something away from home. And now, here's something I can do because I'm so lonely. Both possibilities played a part in her asking for Marina Oswald's address. Ruth drove home with it that night, out of Dallas, below Love Field, and back into Irving. Irving, if you don't know, is between Dallas and Fort Worth, but it's just west of Dallas. Her relationship with the Oswalds had begun its exact 9-month gestation toward another Friday. 24 hours after Everett Glover's party, Marina Oswald tried to, you remember I have to be careful with those words, so she tried to take herself out. That February, Lee had been regularly beating his wife, and on Saturday the 23rd, in the worst fit of temper he'd ever thrown, over the way she had prepared supper, he started to choke her. A fortuitous cry from Junie made him desist, but later the same evening he found Marina standing atop the toilet, attempting to hang herself with a length of clothesline. Oswald halted the strangulation that a little while earlier he had tried to accomplish himself. Ruth did not know that most of Dallas's small community of Russian immigrants had already washed their hands of the couple. They might see Marina as one of them, but they had decided that Lee was a grandiose lout. Some of the Russians had noticed the bruises. If his wife kept going back to him, it was, finally, her problem. One woman from the group who had been helpful the previous fall, not many months after the Oswalds' arrival from the USSR, regarded his defection to that country as prima facie evidence of mental problems, and none of his more recent behavior had changed her mind. Within a week of meeting Marina, Ruth made use of the address she had asked for, and she sent a note to 214 Neely Street. The Oswalds had no phone. In reply, Marina thanked her twice for not forgetting us, as so many people who spent time around the couple preferred to do. During March, the two women visited, twice in Dallas and then in Irving, and introduced their small children to one another. "You don't know how much I enjoyed being at your home and in your company," Marina wrote afterwards. "I say this sincerely without flattery, and not only because I don't get to go anywhere, but also because I feel at ease with you as at home." She also felt safe there. A supper in Irving, at which Michael and Lee could get acquainted, was arranged for Tuesday, April 2nd. "I regretted that I hadn't had a chance to meet this fellow," Michael remembers, pretty sure that Ruth organized the dinner to make up for that. He drove into Dallas to pick up the carless Oswalds, and in the event, didn't much like his first impression of Lee. He was speaking to Marina in Russian, scolding her, I think, for being slow to be packed up with the baby's things. And I think I told him that Ruth was not one to get too upset about being a little bit late. I didn't tell him exactly that, but I did tell him this isn't a great matter. But his tone of voice toward Marina and her having to take these whiplashes meekly and quietly and obediently was offensive to me. Over the next 7 months, where Oswald was concerned, nothing would bother Michael more than Lee's refusal to let Marina learn English. Oswald remained curt to Marina through dinner. Ruth was already allowing her dislike of him to form, even if it went against her nature to let such an attitude harden. "I think," she says, "he was pretty satisfied with his view of how life was, in the sense that he had it figured out. Which is to say that his kind were ripe for exploitation and that he didn't get enough credit for what he did or was capable of." Michael remembers him complaining about how his boss at the photo shop got paid enough to own a Chrysler. The subject of Edwin A. Walker, the rabble-rousing right-wing general, also came up briefly. It would have been hard to avoid talking about Walker at the time, Michael now points out. The general was both a local and national celebrity, and a peculiar smile crossed Oswald's face at the mention of Walker's name. But Michael didn't pursue the topic very far. "I was wanting to get along with this fellow." It's interesting to read this. I don't know if it's going to cover this, but one of the things that reportedly Lee and Michael would end up doing together is going to political extremist meetings. Michael, in the documentary that I mentioned earlier, mentioned that that was an interest that both men shared. So it's interesting to me that he would avoid bringing up a political topic here, because that would end up being something that would apparently unite them enough to have like 5 or 6 different meetings of going to extremist political meetings, which I have to say I've never done with anyone. I don't know about you, but that's not some way that I spend my time. So it's interesting that he doesn't want to bring it up and doesn't want to pursue it further, because that might be offensive when that's a way that they would later connect. Ruth knew the Oswalds were expecting a second child, and over supper she held her tongue about a distressing piece of information that Marina had imparted during one of their March visits. Lee wanted to send his wife back to Russia. Already trying to figure out how she might help avert this, Ruth sat down on Sunday, April 7th, to draft a letter she didn't intend to mail, but whose composition would help her to find the Russian words for an offer she might soon deliver in person. "I want to invite you to move here and live with me both now and later when the baby is born. I don't know how things are for you at home with your husband. I don't know what would be better for you, June, and Lee, to live together or apart. It is, of course, your affair, and you have to decide what is better and what you wish to do. But I want to say that you have a choice. When you wish, for days, weeks, or months, you could move here. I want you to consider 2515 West 5th Street your second home. I have already thought about this invitation a lot. It is not a quick thought. In exchange for Marina's help with Russian, Ruth would pay for all the groceries and incidentals. Lee could cover medical expenses and clothes. Marina could sleep with June in the front bedroom and perhaps help a little with housekeeping, not Ruth's strong suit. In the course of 2 weeks, you could learn all I know about cooking. The idea was bold. She had seen this girl only a handful of times. And somewhat dangerous, too. She remembers feeling that if she made the offer and Marina accepted it, she would be taking on some of the role of support that Lee would feel was his. And I wanted to be sure he didn't feel undercut or supplanted in any way by my actions. In a later portion of her unsent letter, she put the matter gently, encouraging Marina to regard the two of them as being in a similar situation. I don't want to hurt Lee. Of course I don't know what he wants. Perhaps he feels like Michael, who at one time wants and doesn't want to live with me. Ruth's religion and character told her to seek and spread light. But from this point on, for the nearly 8 months that would follow, the two adults who dominate her emotional life, Michael and Marina, will be keeping her in the dark. According to Ruth's statebook, she and Marina may have visited on April 11th. Then, or later, Marina did not disclose that the man responsible for that week's big news story, an attempt to kill General Walker, was her husband. Well, this is an assertion that's not supported by fact. When you look into the General Walker shooting, you quickly learn that there were likely at least 2 people who were directly involved. The witnesses saw 2. So it's just not true that Lee Oswald was the sole person responsible for that, but there's also good reason to believe he wasn't a part of it at all. This book just writes it as part of the narrative that's being put forward. I just do want to point out there are no footnotes that I see. I look and there's no endnotes either. So this is sort of a narrative told like a novel, but asserted as fact. So if you're interested in this book, you might want to know that. She had known it, so it's talking about Marina. Marina had known about this attempt on General Walker since the night of April 10th when Lee departed on his mission, and she found his list of written instructions about what she should do if he was captured. Despite her recent, Marina had a strong instinct for survival. She said nothing to Ruth, and she held on to the incriminating list, knowing it might one day provide useful leverage against her crazy husband, Lee. Michael Paine, from the first hour he had met him, had known something equally crucial about Oswald. But his information, too, would be kept from Ruth for 30 years. That's setting up quite a cliffhanger, isn't it? I want to know, what is it you know, Michael? I'm actually not aware of what truth he's pointing to, so I hope that that's revealed in the remaining pages of our reading today. By the middle of April, Lee had lost his job at the graphic arts company and decided to seek work in New Orleans, his birthplace, where he still had family. Ruth learned this on Wednesday, April 24th, when she arrived at Neely Street for a planned visit with Marina and found Lee headed for the bus station. He had a cumbersome load of suitcases and duffel bags, so she offered to drive him to the terminal, several blocks from Dealey Plaza. His plan was to have Marina join him in Louisiana once he found a job. I do want to say this is quite a time to happen to drop by. It's one of the facts that makes me wonder if this was a planned and known arrangement of some kind. That she would just show up when he has a cumbersome load of suitcases and duffel bags seems beyond coincidental to me. Well, Ruth now took the chance to suggest that Marina and June stay with her in Irving until Lee was ready to call for them, an arrangement that suddenly suited everyone's convenience and pride. Lee had a more compelling reason to get out of town than he did to protest Ruth's kindness. The police were still looking for Walker's would-be assassin. Soon after Marina moved into the front bedroom on West 5th, Ruth wrote her own mother about what good company the younger woman was, even if Ruth's still imperfect Russian made communication laborious. In fact, both women experienced some of the linguistic isolation Ruth had once felt at Middlebury. The household's other voices, 2-year-old Chris and 3.5-year-old Lynn, were learning the Russian nouns for items like diaper before picking up their English equivalents. The mothers worked hard, dealing with pinworms and children's quarrels. For all its drudgery, this brief period, little more than 2 weeks, would stand out as a kind of feminine idol, a respite from male boorishness and inattention. It came to an abrupt close on May 9th with a phone call from Lee. He had found work, a job he would loathe, greasing coffee machines, and he wanted his wife to come to New Orleans. Papa nas lubit. Papa loves us, Marina exclaimed to Junie. Ruth's love was easily come by. A return of Lee's made for victory and resurgent pride. I don't know what drew them to each other, Ruth says, but she could see there was a bonding between husband and wife, and she took pains not to throw cold water on Marina's enthusiasm. She did not know the couple's shared secret of Oswald's violence against General Walker and against Marina herself. And so one day after Lee's phone call, doing what she felt was right, Ruth drove Marina to New Orleans. It's quite amazing, honestly. Who among us could just drop our lives and say, sure, I'll drive you tomorrow? Did all of the children go along? Did she have someone that she regularly relied on for babysitting? We aren't told. This is a woman of luxury, a woman with no obligations whatever. So she just drives her to New Orleans. That's the end of it. Again, it's suspicious to me. Lee appeared proud of the apartment he had found on Magazine Street. Ruth and her 2 children spent 3 nights there. And while the trip created a few pleasant memories, some sightseeing at Lake Pontchartrain, this also should hold a little red flag for any of us who have studied the assassination, because Lake Pontchartrain reportedly is where Lee and others were training Cuban revolutionaries in warfare tactics. So I don't know what we do with that. Did Ruth know that it was that lake? Was it known among them? We aren't told. We don't know. But Lake Pontchartrain is mentioned here. But Ruth was soon unsettled by the cockroaches and the bickering. She reported later that she and the children would sleep on pallets and kind of make a ring of bug spray around themselves to try to keep the cockroaches at bay. Marina, having had a spell of modern suburban comforts back in Irving, seemed less impressed than Lee by this apartment and began picking at her husband over things like his attempt to make wine from blackberries. Whatever blows she had taken from him, Marina was not wholly without defensive weaponry. She certainly did get irritated and speak back very sharply to him, Ruth recalls. And of course, having better facility in Russian, she usually got the better of a verbal argument. So Ruth was able to listen in on their conversations and hear Marina giving him up one side and down the other her complaints. Now, I do want to point out here that physical violence is, of course, completely off limits. I am thankful that they give this side of it, that Marina was badgering and humiliating to him as a man. I think that's an important understanding of how the marriage relationship was damaged on both sides. That's not at all to excuse physical violence. I just am glad that this book deals honestly with that part as well. For all their volatility and poor financial prospects, Ruth did think the Oswalds might take root in New Orleans. And soon after getting home to Texas, she was wistful for Marina's company. There was no longer anyone with whom to share the bottle boiling and the laundry folding. And rather disappointingly, her Russian class at St. Mark's ended up consisting of a single 2T, Bill Hootkins, whose father paid Ruth directly. Within days of getting home, Ruth found in Michael's desk her typewritten 1956 prayer. I want to be free in my marriage, in my life, to pursue this path of increased belief, and removed it to her iron file box, as if her feelings could no longer belong to anyone but herself. Her first letter to Marina in New Orleans describes matters as humorously as possible. Home again and everything as usual. The floor must be washed and dishes clothes, especially dull after our visit, which was interesting and unusual. Michael didn't call to ask about my trip, and finally I called him at work since he was never at home in his apartment. Today I'm angry with him and intend to go to New York to look for a lover. He loves his machines, and that's all. Well, that's a very non-Christian letter. We're told that she's this sweet Quaker woman, but she's married. Her husband isn't home anymore, and she's writing to Marina about going to New York to look for a lover. This is quite shocking writing, particularly for 1963. Even if it's a joke, in 1963, this just seems very, very dismissive of your marriage vows. Marina's emotional fortunes had taken an even more sudden downturn. She replied to Ruth on May 25th. As soon as you left, all love stopped, and I am very hurt that Lee's attitude towards me is such that I feel each minute that I bind him. She recognizes a fundamental unhappiness linking her to Ruth. Lee has said to me that he doesn't love me. So you see, we came to mistaken conclusions. It is hard for you and me to live without a return of our love. Interesting. How will it all end? There was supposed to be a practical aspect to the correspondence. Marina would correct the Russian in Ruth's letters and send them back to Texas, but the emotional interchange outweighed the linguistic one. Everything you do and think is interesting to me, Ruth tells Marina on June 1st, in the same letter containing the news that she's made an appointment, later canceled, with a divorce lawyer. Marina, whom Oswald was trying to keep from seeing any Russians in New Orleans, tries to console Ruth, not only with the truth that misery loves company, you are not the only rejected one in this world, but also with a sort of forlorn optimism. Surely a person can carry on through all the most heavy losses, trials, and misfortunes. I think we will not perish, but that something will smile brightly on us too. Don't you think so? This is quite high dialogue for someone who supposedly is learning Russian. I have worked to learn other languages, and it's a difficult thing to get past basic necessities of, shopping and food and general greetings. It's a very high level to be able to discuss emotions and losses and marriage and binding your husband. These are high level words and vocabulary in Russian. And my understanding is that Russian is an incredibly difficult language to learn, that it's ranked among the top in the world. So for Ruth to already have obtained this level, but then to tell us that she really had very not good Russian, something doesn't match there. Ruth had already begun inquiring about whether Marina might like to return to Texas for the baby's birth, expected in October, though she was careful to address the details about fees at Grand Prairie's Plattner Clinic to Lee directly. Her desire to bring Marina back became pressing in the second week of July, during a busy period that included separate visits from her parents. Ruth reread Marina's correspondence and noticed something she had earlier missed. Mention of Lee's renewed insistence that his wife go back to the Soviet Union. Alarmed, Ruth asked some Quaker and Unitarian connections in New Orleans to check on Mrs. Oswald, and with Michael, she drew up definite financial arrangements under which Marina might come to Irving. In a letter written July 11th, she gives Lee, as always, a wide berth. I don't know how Lee feels. I would like to know. Surely things are hard for him now, too. I hope that he would be glad to see you with me, where he knows that you and the children will receive everything that is necessary, and he would not need to worry about it. Thus, he could start life again. This is not the reflections of a woman trying to give in to support the marriage. This is a woman who's like, here, you want me to show you the door? Here, let me tell you about the open door. The door is right here. It's large, plenty big enough for you and your children. Let me tell you about all the amenities beyond the door. It's like, let me walk you out of your marriage with my help. And let me tell you all of the reasons why it's great. Now, I could see this being a humanitarian effort, particularly if she had known about the violence, but she didn't know about the violence. And so she's just quickly like, here, let me help you out of your marriage, which again, in 1963 is a shocking thing to do. The following day, she writes again to suggest that Marina can't be made to go back to Russia without wanting to, but mostly to say, I love you, Marina, and I want to live with you. To the suggestion that she and Marina had a lesbian attachment, Ruth today replies with a laugh, no, that hadn't occurred to me. I mean, to believe that she was a feminist woman from the Northeast who was happily showing a new acquaintance the exit door in her marriage without having known there was violence and without there being the possibility of that is a little bit absurd. If you're liberal enough to have talked someone out of their marriage in 1963 after just a few encounters, and yes, a 2-week period of living together, but at no point apparently was she informed about the violence. So for her to be talking someone out of their marriage makes her a certain kind of woman in 1963, and to act like, oh, I had no idea about lesbianism back then is a bit absurd. It's okay to say no, but no, that hadn't occurred to me is farther. We've talked about this before with the behavior panel people, that a quick and confident no is enough to put an end to an answer of no. But when you add more, no, that hadn't occurred to me, with a laugh, I don't know. It's a bit much. That's not to say that I think there was, necessarily. The reason why this comes up, in case you don't know, is not just because people are trying to make sense of these old letters. It's also because there was a report that a significant number of lesbian films were found in Mrs. Payne's garage. And so that's where this accusation comes from. It's not out of thin air, and it's not because she said, I love you to Marina. There's more to it than that. She acknowledges that even in 1963, she remained very lonely in Texas, and that her own vulnerability helped push her into aiding this foreign girl. But what she still hears in the apparently romantic tone of her letters is an attempt to reassure the younger woman who doubted her acceptability and her own worthiness of Ruth's assistance. I was trying to say, we can be friends here. As for Oswald's own possible homosexuality, a matter still interesting to students of his months in New Orleans, she had never a thought in that direction. But you have to understand how naive I was. Would I have even known? She asks. Marina talked only of the girlfriends Lee had had prior to meeting her. Marina herself was afraid to discuss the Texas invitation with Lee. She tried to assure Ruth that things were better between them. For a considerable period, he has been good to me. But Ruth's extended hand did draw from the young Soviet woman a flood of pro-American sentiment. I love your people and your country, and I thank you, and all, that you are such good people. God grant that there would always be peacetime and that people would treat each other only so. She promised to keep Ruth's offer, should Lee again treat her badly. Sweet Ruth, I am so thankful to you for your good and sympathetic heart. From her days in the co-op program, which required her to drive from one far-flung job to another, Ruth had been a confident traveler. Late summer 1963 found her tracing a zigzag from Texas to New England, to the Midwest, to the Deep South. Her 2 small children would see a lot of the USA in their mother's '55 Chevrolet. But the trio's odyssey did not take in the era's usual high points of automotive sightseeing. Ruth's Hallmark date book for August and September, suddenly unfestooned with dental appointments and school board voting reminders, looks as blank as the open road. but she was in fact following a complex itinerary designed to connect her with an array of family members and old friends. She made it from Irving to Massachusetts in about 5 days and spent the early part of August at the Forbes property on Noshawn Island. What it doesn't tell us about this part, because it just moves on to the next set of people that she saw after this, Noshawn Island has been owned by the Paine family, her husband's family, for now centuries. And this isn't just the Forbes property, but it's also a place where CIA agents and connections like Mary Bancroft, who was the mistress to Alan Dulles, who sat at the top of the CIA, that they often spent their summers there. So it makes it sound like, oh, this is all just her seeing her family. This is her seeing intelligence-connected family that was Michael's family during a time when she was supposedly separated and having problems with Michael. I just want to point that out. So it talks about other people she saw in Columbus and this and that. All along the way, she visited Quakers she had known since the 50s. It doesn't mention her seeing her sister, who was also a CIA agent. Let's see if it does. It keeps going. It says all of the travel was just part of how I solved the loneliness and distance from family. I mean, she saw family. She saw Michael's family. She saw her own sister in D.C., and her own sister and father were both reportedly CIA. I believe her sister's has been confirmed through tax returns. I think her father has been also. He was a part of USAID, which is a known State Department / CIA organization that's used as a cover. She, in the documentary, kind of hedges on both points and tries to act like she had no clue that either of them had anything to do with the CIA. Later, she's shown a paper about her sister, and so she says, well, I guess she might have been. But that's all she does. So she doesn't mention that. It does say if there was one thing she failed to accomplish this time, it was the side trip to the Washington Mall to hear Dr. King, which she could have made while seeing her sister. So it does mention her sister, but it kind of diverts us from having anything. They didn't go see MLK. So what did they do? We aren't told. After this, she arrived in New Orleans on Friday, September 20th, expecting just to visit. Despite her husband's unemployment, Marina Oswald seemed cheerful and wanted Ruth to have a good time. She proposed a tour of Bourbon Street without Lee. It was so obvious that we were out of place, Ruth recollects with a smile. A pregnant mother and her baby, and a mother and her two small toddlers, peering into the doorways. And the people peered back with a, "Good grief, what are you doing here?" look on their faces. So we didn't stay long. The little outing recalled last May's household in Irving, an arrangement that was about to reconstitute itself. Far from feeling threatened, Lee now seemed relieved to have Marina come back with me and to know that I could translate to get her into the hospital, things like that. He let Ruth believe that he was going to work in Houston or maybe even Philadelphia, a city she had spoken of. But Marina knew the truth. Once she and Ruth were gone, Lee would be heading for Mexico City in search of a visit to Cuba. She said nothing to her friend. Ruth remembers Lee being unusually helpful on Monday morning, the 23rd, when it came time to load up the station wagon. The back of it was soon full of Marina's belongings and his own, which it was understood he would come for at some point. Only after the car was packed did he and the departing travelers note a soft tire. So we had to unpack some and get to a gas station to buy a spare, Ruth recalls. The new purchase further obscured some of the vehicle's contents. Instead of putting the spare tire under everything in the car, we put it on top, because that was an issue if we had a flat. We'd have to get everything out. But nothing went wrong. Oswald bid a genuinely sad goodbye to his girls, and the car departed. Marina let out a cheer when she crossed the border into Texas, telling Ruth, somewhat surprisingly, that she thought of the state as her home. After a night in a motel, the women continued on to Irving, where Michael Paine was on hand to help unload the car. Among the goods carried into the garage was a well-tied green and brown blanket roll containing a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The only adult there who didn't know that Oswald owned it was Ruth, the only person who wouldn't have allowed it anywhere in the house. Perhaps that's the point that he knew about. I think that's a good guess for us. I do want to say at this point that our very next reading is going to be JFK on the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison. And in this book, we are going to read about Lee Oswald's time in New Orleans. So we will get the corresponding part to the details we're being given in this book to look at the question of what Lee was doing in New Orleans during this summer that we've just basically skipped over through Ruth Payne's account. On Friday, October 4th, Ruth Payne donated blood at Parkland Hospital, where Marina would soon be delivering her baby at reduced cost. Of course, we note that Parkland Hospital is where the president would die in November or be pronounced dead. It's likely he was already dead from the moment of the headshot. And also where Lee Oswald would die 2 days following. Later in the day, when Lee Oswald surprised his wife with a phone call announcing that he was at the bus station in Irving and would like Ruth to come pick him up, Marina said that Ruth was still too weak to drive because she had donated blood. Oswald's call ended another 2-week spell, like last May's, of near constant companionship between Marina and Ruth. The absent father-to-be would continue to maintain that he had spent the time hunting for work unsuccessfully in Houston. Upon showing up in Irving, he certainly did look defeated, though he had actually come from Mexico City, where he had failed to get his visa for Cuba. Now prepared to look for work in Dallas, he'd already gotten himself a bed at the Y and would soon rent the $7 a week room in the Oak Cliff neighborhood near downtown. He could visit Marina on the weekends if that was all right with Ruth. Once he was on his feet, perhaps after Christmas, he would get an apartment able to hold himself, his wife, and what would then be 2 children. Ruth supplied Lee with a Dallas street map, whose job hunting X's would soon appear overly meaningful to those studying his possessions. Well, that would be meaningful. I'd love to have a copy of the map. If any of you know, I haven't seen this map and I haven't heard about it. The things that I have heard about Ruth trying to help him find a job was that she was the one who connected him with the Texas School Book Depository, and that the very week that she told him about that job, she actually got a call from a job that would have paid him significantly more than the Texas School Book Depository, and she failed to communicate that to Lee. For a family that was trying to get back on their feet and trying to achieve financial means, that's a pretty rude thing to do, I think, to not inform him of a job that was available to him had he shown up. So, if you have information about this job hunting map with X's in meaningful places, I would love to know about it. You can leave the link in the comments. If for some reason you can't, sometimes YouTube will delete comments that have a link in them. If it deletes them, then you could send them to me in an email. My email is on my channel page. His search for work was hampered, not just by a lack of car, but by his inability to drive. Ruth soon made plans to get him a learner's permit and give him lessons in the '55 Chevy. Lee did seem to be making an effort. Ruth never expressed herself more positively about Oswald than she does in a letter written to her mother on October 14th. During the 2 previous weekends, she says, he has proved himself a happy addition to our expanded family. He played with Chris, watched football on TV, planed down the doors that wouldn't close. This notes that might be filing. Yes, planing down is filing. And generally added a needed masculine flavor. From a poor first impression, I have come to like him, she wrote. Ruth's improved feelings were mostly a matter of hope and effort. One senses her during this crucial week trying to wish Oswald into something he could never be. On Saturday, she writes her father that Lee has shown himself to be a fine family man after all. He has earned the title by taking a job. Minimum wage and nothing special about it, she reported to her mother, but she's pleased to see him happy. Characteristically, she takes no credit for having provided the successful lead. Like we talked about, she did provide the lead to get him to the Texas School Book Depository. However, what's being withheld here is that there was another job offer to a higher paying job that was never conveyed to Lee. On the morning of the Monday the 14th, after she and Marina had coffee down the street, and Mrs. Lennie Mae Randall mentioned that they were still hiring at the warehouse where her brother worked, it was Ruth who had made the call to Mr. Roy Truly, manager of the Texas School Book Depository, to get Lee an interview. Upon showing up for it, he scored points with his potential new boss by calling him Sir. On Friday night, when Lee came out to Irving after his third day at work, Ruth had a cake ready for his 24th birthday. For the past 2 weeks, she had been seeing to the needs of 5 people, not counting herself, and trying to engage in as much long-term thinking as the busy situation would admit. She seems even to have considered putting a trailer in the backyard should the house still be so full during her mother's planned February visit. The house became more tightly packed with the birth of the Oswald's second daughter on Sunday the 20th. Ruth was at the hospital when the little girl arrived. The fine family man, afraid that Parkland would present him with a bill, stayed in Irving. Even today, Ruth doesn't blame him for this. He may have had a job, but he had hardly the money. And with the hospital's fast discharge procedure for new mothers, Marina would be home in 48 hours. The baby was named Audrey Marina Rachel, the first name for Audrey Hepburn, star of War and Peace, which Marina and Ruth had seen together last May. Rachel was for a niece of Ruth's, and it was the third name that would stick, even though Lee didn't like its Jewish sound. The delivery proved trouble-free. Ruth's blood, not required for it, may still have been on hand 5 Sundays later, when Rachel's father would bleed to death in the same hospital. We're going to go ahead and stop there. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. For my part, I'm very interested in this book. It does read like a novel. It is clearly unsighted, and therefore it's a little difficult to take. It is a narrative, but it does give some interesting details, like Ruth donating blood, or the means by which travel was accomplished, or those sorts of things. I note also that it leaves out details that are not in line with the narrative, so it fails to mention the way that Lee was deprived of the opportunity to have a better paying job by beneficent Ruth Payne, the one that we're told just was of such goodwill toward him and had really changed her view toward him. Not in the slightest. She had his wife and children, and she was giving him a lesser paying job than the one he could have had. Why? Was she directed to point him towards a particular job? Perhaps. Was her own ill feeling toward him negotiating that decision? I'm left to wonder. What about you? What do you wonder about? What do you notice was left out of this account? What else do we need to know? Let us know in the comments. And I want to invite you back for our reading of On the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison. In this book, we are going to look at Lee's time in New Orleans. I bet we'll get a look at Marina a little bit as well, but this one is much more factual. It does have a ton of endnotes that support the things that are asserted. So come back next time for that, and I hope you've enjoyed our look at Mrs. Payne's Garage by Thomas Mallon. Like I've said before, one of the things that's wonderful about this walkthrough that we're doing is that hopefully it's giving you the flavor of various books that we're reading so that you can decide for yourself which ones you might be enjoying and which ones you might want to purchase for your own library. So I hope you are enjoying this series. Let me know in the comments if you know that there's something coming up and you know of a particular piece of literature that would be well suited for a particular chapter. I have pre-arranged most of what I plan to talk about, but I am open to changing even this one. I had not planned this initially, and I made the change today. So I am open to changing. If you're aware of a chapter that's just the perfect thing for some particular aspect of the case, I want to hear about it. So let me know. We'll see you back soon. Hope you have a great day. Bye.